When entire civilizations erase a man's name from their records, there is usually a reason. The shuttle descended through layers of silver clouds, its engines glowing softly against the evening sky above Earth. Beneath it stretched the Atlantic Gateway spaceport, a sprawling complex nearly 5 miles wide where diplomats, merchants, and travelers from dozens of star systems arrived every day. Diplomat Varessa Nyl stood near the observation window inside the passenger cabin, watching the lights of the human world grow brighter beneath her. Her blue-silver skin reflected the amber glow of the instrument panels. Long strands of white hair rested neatly across the shoulders of her formal diplomatic uniform. This was her first official assignment to Earth, and according to every briefing she had received, humans were a fascinating species. Unpredictable, emotional, creative, difficult. She was looking forward to meeting them. The shuttle touched down with barely a vibration. Moments later, the boarding ramp extended toward a private reception platform reserved for high-ranking visitors. Government officials waited below. Security personnel lined the perimeter. Cameras hovered quietly in the air. Varessa stepped onto the platform with practiced confidence. A welcoming committee approached immediately. Introductions began. Protocols were exchanged. Diplomatic greetings followed. Then a woman from Earth's Foreign Affairs Directorate gestured toward a man standing several yards away. Diplomat Nyl, this is Caleb Mercer. He will serve as your personal security liaison during your stay. Varessa looked toward him. She tried very hard not to appear disappointed. Caleb Mercer looked nothing like the elite security specialist she had expected. He wore a simple dark suit. No decorations. No visible rank insignia. No impressive military posture. He appeared almost ordinary. A man who might blend into a crowd without anyone noticing. He offered a polite nod. Welcome to Earth. His voice was calm, controlled, almost quiet. Varessa returned the greeting. You are my bodyguard. That is the assignment. She studied him briefly. Human. Male. Late 30s perhaps. Brown hair. Gray-blue eyes. Nothing remarkable. Around them, the arrival ceremony continued. Reporters recorded footage. Officials exchanged data packets. Cargo drones moved overhead carrying diplomatic equipment toward waiting transports. Everything appeared routine. Then something strange happened. A security scanner positioned beside the platform swept across the arriving passengers. The beam passed over Varessa, then over Caleb. For a fraction of a second, a red symbol flashed across the scanner display. Not yellow, not orange, red, the highest threat classification available. The symbol vanished almost instantly. The screen reset itself before anyone nearby appeared to notice. Anyone except the machine operator. The young technician stared at the display, blinked twice, then quickly looked toward Caleb. His face had gone pale. Caleb seemed completely unaware. Or perhaps he simply chose not to react. Within seconds, another supervisor arrived and quietly escorted the technician away from the scanner station. No explanation was given. No announcement was made. The ceremony continued as if nothing had happened. Varessa almost dismissed the incident. Almost. As she followed the welcoming delegation toward the waiting transport convoy, she glanced back over her shoulder. Caleb was walking several steps behind her, expression unchanged, hands relaxed at his sides. The ordinary bodyguard looked exactly the same as before. Yet somewhere deep inside the spaceport network, a security system had briefly identified him and then immediately erased the result. And for reasons she could not explain, that unsettled her far more than any threat warning ever could. The first official event began less than 2 hours after their arrival. The Interstellar Commerce Summit occupied the upper levels of the Atlantic Gateway Convention Complex, a structure of glass and polished steel overlooking the ocean. Evening sunlight reflected across the water outside, while representatives from dozens of civilizations gathered beneath a ceiling nearly 100 feet high. Soft music drifted through the hall. Translation drones floated silently above the crowd. Varessa Nyl moved through the reception area exchanging formal greetings and diplomatic pleasantries. Everything appeared perfectly normal. Yet she found herself glancing toward Caleb more often than she intended. He remained several steps behind her at all times. Quiet, attentive, unremarkable. Exactly what a professional bodyguard should be, which only made the strange incident at the spaceport harder to forget. The reception continued. Delegates laughed. Trade officials discussed agreements. Journalists recorded interviews. Then a tall, alien representative from the Varel systems turned toward Varessa's group. His expression was pleasant at first, until his eyes settled on Caleb. The change was immediate. The diplomat stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. His posture stiffened. For a moment he simply stared. Then he lowered his gaze and excused himself without explanation. Varessa watched him leave. "That was odd," she said quietly. Caleb showed no reaction. "People are complicated." Before she could question him further, another delegate approached. This one represented a scientific coalition from the outer spiral territories. The elderly alien smiled warmly while introducing himself. Then he noticed Caleb standing nearby. The smile vanished. Not from fear exactly, more like disbelief, as though he had unexpectedly encountered someone from a forgotten chapter of history. He studied Caleb for several uncomfortable seconds. Finally, he shook his head slowly and walked away. Varessa frowned. Twice in less than 10 minutes. Something was happening. Across the room, a third representative looked directly at Caleb and nearly dropped a data tablet. The device slipped from his hands before he hurriedly recovered it. He offered an awkward apology to nobody in particular and immediately left the reception floor. This time Varessa noticed something else. Several nearby delegates had witnessed the reaction. They began whispering among themselves. Not loudly, not enough to attract attention. Yet the whispers spread, like ripples moving outward across still water. She turned toward Caleb. "Do you know these people?" "Some of them." "From where?" Caleb accepted a glass of water from a passing server. "Various places." Varessa stared at him. "That is not an answer." A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "It is the only one I have." Before she could press further, her diplomatic assistant hurried across the room, carrying a tablet. The young aide looked unsettled. "Diplomat, meanwhile, there is something you should see." Varessa accepted the device. On the screen was a security request she had submitted earlier regarding Caleb's personnel file. The request had been denied. Not delayed. Not restricted. Denied. Beneath the rejection notice appeared a single line of text. "Access prohibited under multi-galactic security accords." Varessa read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Slowly she looked up from the screen toward the man standing beside her. Caleb was watching the sunset through the enormous glass wall overlooking the ocean. His expression remained calm. Yet for the first time since arriving on Earth, Varessa began to suspect that her bodyguard was not the mystery. The mystery was why so many powerful people seemed to know exactly who he was. The conference ended shortly after sunset. Delegates returned to hotels, embassies, and diplomatic compounds scattered across the city. Traffic moved through the illuminated air lanes above the Atlantic coast, like rivers of light stretching into the darkness. Varessa Nyl sat alone inside her temporary residence on the 32nd floor of the International Diplomatic Tower. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the ocean. Waves rolled against the shoreline nearly 400 feet below. Yet her attention remained fixed on the glowing screen floating above her desk. The denied personnel request had not disappeared. She read the message again. "Access prohibited under multi-galactic security accords." The wording made no sense. Multi-galactic agreements were rare. Most civilizations struggled to coordinate policies across a single galaxy, let alone several. The fact that such restrictions existed around a single human bodyguard was almost absurd. Varessa opened another inquiry. Then another. Each returned the same result. Denied. Restricted. Unauthorized. Eventually, a final notice appeared. Further requests may trigger automated review. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. Somewhere in the building, Caleb Mercer was undoubtedly carrying out routine security duties. Yet the more she learned, the less routine he seemed. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. Her diplomatic assistant entered carrying a data tablet. The young aide looked hesitant. "There is something else, Diplomat." Varessa accepted the tablet. "What is it?" "I did not find information about him." The aide swallowed. "I found information about people searching for him." Varessa looked up immediately. "Explain." Several documents appeared across the screen. None contained complete details. Most had been heavily censored. Yet a pattern emerged. Over the past 20 years, government agencies, academic institutions, intelligence divisions, and historical archives from numerous star systems had all submitted inquiries regarding Caleb Mercer. Thousands of requests. Nearly all denied. Varessa stared at the list. Why would so many organizations be interested in one person? The aide shook her head. I do not know. Another image appeared. A photograph taken years earlier. The image quality was poor. A group of officials stood beside a transport vessel somewhere on the edge of explored space. Caleb appeared in the background. Not speaking. Not posing. Simply walking away from the camera. That is all. Varessa asked. That is all we could recover. After the aide left, Varessa remained by the window for nearly an hour. Far below, city lights reflected across the dark water. Her thoughts kept returning to the same question. Who was Caleb Mercer before he became a bodyguard? Elsewhere in the tower, Caleb stood alone on an observation deck open to the night air. The ocean breeze moved through his hair. He held a small cup of coffee and watched cargo ships crossing the horizon. His expression was calm, but his eyes lingered on a distant point in the sky. Then a faint tone sounded from a device hidden inside his pocket. One notification. No message. No sender. Just a symbol. Caleb looked at it for several seconds before locking the screen. For the first time all day, concern crossed his face. Somewhere far beyond Earth, someone had just learned exactly where he was. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of brushed steel. Rain clouds drifted above the Atlantic coast, while diplomatic transports moved between the towers surrounding the convention district. Varessa, meanwhile, had barely slept. The unanswered questions surrounding Caleb Mercer occupied her thoughts from the moment she opened her eyes. By 8 o'clock, she was already seated inside a secure conference room, reviewing schedules for the next round of negotiations. Representatives from 7-star systems would attend. Trade agreements, transportation corridors, cultural exchanges. Nothing unusual, nothing controversial. Yet, even while reading the briefing documents, she found herself looking toward the empty chair near the entrance where Caleb normally waited during meetings. A few minutes later, the door opened. Caleb entered carrying a tablet and a cup of coffee. His expression was calm as always. If he had received troubling news during the night, there was no visible sign of it. Good morning, Varessa said. Morning. He placed the tablet on the table. Security routes have been updated. Nothing significant. The simplicity of the statement irritated her more than she expected. Do you always answer questions before people ask them? A faint smile appeared. Only when I know which questions are coming. Before Varessa could respond, delegates began arriving. The meeting proceeded normally at first. Officials exchanged reports. Economic projections filled the displays. Translators converted dozens of languages into a common format. Then the atmosphere changed. A representative from the Helion frontier entered the room nearly 10 minutes late. He apologized politely while taking his seat. His eyes moved around the table. Then they landed on Caleb. The representative froze. Not dramatically, not enough to attract immediate attention. Yet Varessa noticed. The alien official stared for nearly 3 seconds before quickly looking away. Throughout the rest of the meeting, he spoke less than anyone else in the room. Twice she caught him glancing toward Caleb. Each time his expression grew more uneasy. After the session ended, the representative departed immediately without participating in any informal discussions. Varessa watched him leave. Something was definitely wrong. Later that afternoon, she decided to stop guessing. Using diplomatic authority codes, she accessed a historical archive maintained by the Galactic Records Bureau. The database contained information stretching back hundreds of years. Names, events, expeditions, government proceedings. She entered a simple search request. Caleb Mercer. The system processed for several seconds. Then a message appeared. Search result, insufficient access. Beneath it sat a list of reference markers. 12 separate jurisdictions. 12 separate security authorities. 12 separate restrictions. Varessa leaned closer to the screen. Most people were protected by one government. Occasionally two. She had never seen 12. As she examined the list, another detail caught her attention. The restrictions did not originate from military organizations alone. Scientific councils appeared. Historical preservation agencies. Exploration authorities. Diplomatic alliances. The pattern made even less sense than before. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the ocean, Caleb stood quietly on a balcony overlooking the city. Far above the horizon, a tiny point of light appeared among the stars. To everyone else it looked ordinary. Caleb watched it for several seconds. Then his expression hardened slightly. The object was not moving toward Earth. It was moving toward him. The following morning began with an unusual silence. The city outside remained busy as ever. Air traffic crossed the horizon. Cargo vessels moved through orbital lanes. Thousands of people followed their routines. Yet inside the diplomatic district, subtle changes were beginning to appear. Additional security personnel occupied key locations. Communication systems underwent unexpected inspections. Several scheduled meetings were quietly rescheduled without explanation. Varessa and Weil noticed all of it. She stood beside a window overlooking the harbor while reviewing the day's agenda. Normally, such adjustments would not concern her. Diplomacy often involved constant changes. But after everything she had learned about Caleb Mercer, every irregular detail seemed connected to a larger puzzle. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Caleb entered carrying a tablet containing updated travel routes. His expression remained as calm as ever. "There have been changes?" Varessa asked. Caleb nodded. "A few. Security concerns?" "Possibly." She studied him carefully. "You already know more than you are telling me." For a brief moment he remained silent. Then he looked toward the harbor. Several transport vessels floated above the water in perfect formation. Sometimes information creates more problems than it solves. Varessa folded her arms. "That sounds like something people say when they do not want to answer questions." A faint smile appeared. "That too." Before she could continue, an urgent notification appeared on her terminal. "Incoming diplomatic request. Origin, Helion Frontier Authority. Priority, immediate." Varessa opened the message. It contained only a single question. "Is Caleb Mercer currently assigned to your protection detail?" Nothing else. No explanation. No context. She looked up. "Do you know who sent this?" Caleb glanced at the screen. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not fear. Recognition. "Yes." "Should I answer?" He considered the question for several seconds. Not yet. The response only deepened the mystery. Later that afternoon, another message arrived. Then another. Different governments. Different organizations. Different regions of space. Yet every inquiry centered on the same subject. Caleb Mercer. Nobody threatened him. Nobody accused him of anything. They simply wanted confirmation that he was there. Watching. Waiting. Searching. By evening, the number of requests had climbed into the dozens. Varessa finally stopped trying to understand the situation through official channels. Instead, she joined Caleb on the observation deck overlooking the ocean. The wind carried the scent of salt water across the railing. Far below, waves rolled against the shoreline. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then Varessa broke the silence. "Who are you really?" Caleb rested his hands against the rail and watched the horizon. The setting sun painted the clouds in shades of gold and crimson. "Someone trying to stay forgotten." "That is not an answer. It is the truth." Varessa looked at him. There was no deception in his voice. No attempt to impress her. Only exhaustion. The kind carried by someone who had spent a very long time running from attention. At that moment, a transport shuttle crossed the horizon and disappeared into the clouds. Caleb followed it with his eyes until it vanished completely. Then he quietly added something he had not planned to say. "The problem is that some people never stop looking." The next morning arrived under heavy clouds. A steady rain drifted across the city, turning the glass towers of the diplomatic district into shimmering pillars of silver. From her office window, Varessa watched aircraft move through the storm while reviewing another stack of messages concerning Caleb Mercer. The number had grown overnight. Governments, research institutes, historical archives, exploration councils. The requests came from every corner of known space. None contained threats. None demanded action. They all asked the same question. "Have you located Caleb Mercer?" The repetition was becoming impossible to ignore. By noon, a special diplomatic session had been scheduled at the convention complex. Representatives from multiple civilizations gathered to discuss transportation agreements and scientific cooperation. The atmosphere appeared normal. Polite conversations filled the corridors. Translation drones floated quietly overhead. Yet Varessa sensed an unusual tension beneath the surface. Several delegates kept checking private communications. Others appeared distracted. Caleb noticed it too. As they entered the main conference hall, his eyes moved slowly across the room. He studied exits, observation balconies, security stations, and communication panels. Not nervously, methodically, like someone assembling a puzzle. Varessa leaned closer. "You expected something?" Caleb kept walking. I expected questions. The meeting began. For nearly an hour, everything proceeded according to schedule. Economic forecasts appeared on floating displays. Trade routes were discussed. Infrastructure proposals were reviewed. Then every screen in the hall suddenly went dark. The room fell silent. A second later, the lights dimmed. Delegates exchanged confused looks. Technicians immediately began checking systems. Communication links stopped responding. External networks disappeared. Even local channels failed. No alarms sounded. No emergency warnings appeared. The systems had not crashed. They had simply stopped talking to one another. The effect was immediate. Conversations grew louder. Advisors began checking backup devices. Security teams received conflicting instructions from different departments. Within minutes, confusion spread through the building. Vanessa watched the situation deteriorate and felt her pulse quicken. Then she noticed something unusual. Caleb was not surprised. While everyone else reacted, he was already moving. He crossed the room toward a side corridor rarely used during conferences. "Where are you going?" Vanessa asked. "To the only place this makes sense." She followed him. Together, they moved through service passages hidden behind the public sections of the convention center. The farther they walked, the quieter everything became. Rain tapped softly against distant windows. Emergency lighting reflected off polished walls. Finally, Vanessa stopped. "You knew this would happen." Caleb looked ahead without slowing. "Not exactly." "Then how?" He was silent for several steps. "Because I have seen the pattern before." The answer settled heavily between them. Vanessa realized he was no longer speaking about Earth, or this building, or even this decade. Somewhere in his past, something remarkably similar had happened. Ahead, another corridor curved into darkness. Caleb studied it for a moment. Then he nodded slightly, as though confirming his suspicion. For the first time since arriving on Earth, he looked less like a bodyguard and more like a man who had returned to a problem he thought he left behind years ago. The corridor narrowed as Caleb led Vanessa deeper into the convention complex. The polished public architecture gradually gave way to maintenance accessways rarely seen by visitors. Exposed conduits ran along the ceiling. Soft white utility lights reflected across metallic walls. Somewhere above them, hundreds of delegates were still attempting to understand why every major communication system had suddenly gone silent. Yet Caleb moved with absolute certainty. He never hesitated at intersections. He never checked maps. He simply walked. Vanessa noticed. "You know where you are going." "I know where I would hide the problem," Caleb replied. "That is not the same thing." But even as he said it, they turned another corner and arrived at a secured service junction hidden behind an unmarked access panel. Several technicians stood nearby looking confused. Diagnostic tools floated around them, while status displays flickered with conflicting information. One technician looked relieved when he saw Caleb. "Sir, every system points somewhere different." Caleb glanced at the screens. "Because the systems are being used against each other." The technician frowned. "What does that mean?" Caleb stepped closer to the display. Within seconds, he began isolating data pathways and rerouting monitoring channels. Not rapidly, not dramatically, simply methodically, like someone performing a familiar task. The technicians exchanged surprised looks. Vanessa watched quietly. 5 minutes earlier, these specialists had appeared completely lost. Now they were following Caleb's instructions without question. More surprising was the fact that the instructions worked. One by one, sections of the network began responding again. Internal maps returned. Environmental controls stabilized. Restricted access routes reappeared. "How did you know where to start?" one technician asked. Caleb studied the data stream. "Because whoever designed this wanted people to chase symptoms instead of causes." The technician blinked. "You figured that out already?" Caleb offered a small shrug. "Patterns repeat." The answer seemed too simple. Yet nobody had a better explanation. Several floors above, emergency coordinators suddenly reported improvements. Communication channels were partially restored. Security teams regained access to location tracking. Confusion began fading from the building. Vanessa stood beside Caleb as another display activated. A complex network diagram appeared across the screen. Hundreds of routes connected through a single hidden node buried beneath multiple layers of infrastructure. The technicians stared in disbelief. They had not found it. Caleb had. "That is impossible," one of them whispered. Caleb remained focused on the display. "No, it is intentional." Varessa folded her arms. You speak as though you know the people responsible. For the first time, Caleb looked genuinely thoughtful. Not the people. His eyes remained fixed on the network map. The method. Silence followed. Outside, rain continued tapping against the enormous glass roof of the convention center. Somewhere far beyond Earth, messages were still moving between distant governments asking the same question they had asked for years. Have you found Caleb Mercer? Standing in the quiet service junction, Varessa finally began to understand why. It was not because he was stronger than anyone else. It was not because he carried authority. It was because he seemed capable of seeing connections long before anyone realized they existed. And as the hidden node slowly revealed itself on the screen, Varessa had the uncomfortable feeling that Caleb already knew what they were about to discover. The hidden node finally opened. Lines of data flowed across the display like streams of light racing through a dark tunnel. The technicians gathered around the screen in silence. What they expected to find was a malicious program, a foreign intrusion, or some sophisticated attempt to disrupt the conference. What appeared instead was a message archive. Thousands of encrypted records. Thousands of requests. Thousands of unanswered inquiries originating from every corner of known space. One technician slowly shook his head. These are not attack instructions. Another leaned closer to the display. They are searches. Varessa stared at the scrolling data. Names of governments appeared. Scientific coalitions. Exploration authorities. Historical councils. Diplomatic alliances. Some requests were decades old. Others had arrived only hours earlier. Every one of them centered on the same individual. Caleb Mercer. The room grew quiet. Nobody understood why. Caleb did. He looked away from the display and toward the rain-covered ceiling above them. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he quietly exhaled. I was hoping this would never happen. Varessa turned toward him. What exactly is happening? Caleb remained silent long enough that she wondered if he would answer at all. Finally he spoke. Years ago, there was a crisis. The technicians exchanged glances. Nobody interrupted. A very large one. His voice remained calm. Entire transportation networks stopped functioning. Communication systems failed. Governments lost contact with one another. Nobody understood what they were looking at because everyone was focused on the immediate problems instead of the underlying pattern. One technician pointed toward the display. Like this. Caleb nodded once. Exactly like this. The room became even quieter. Varessa studied him carefully. You were involved. It was not a question. Caleb looked at the streams of old requests filling the screen. I was nearby. Nobody believed that answer. Not anymore. Another technician opened one of the archived records. A heavily restricted document appeared for less than a second before authorization protocols blocked access. Yet a single sentence remained visible. Subject participated in intergalactic stabilization event. The file vanished immediately afterward. The technicians stared at the empty screen. Varessa felt a chill move through her. Intergalactic stabilization event. The phrase sounded far too large to describe a normal operation. She looked back toward Caleb. You solved it. Caleb shook his head. A lot of people solved it. But they are searching for you. They are searching for answers. His expression softened slightly. People tend to confuse the two. Above them, communication systems throughout the convention center continued recovering. Delegates returned to meetings. Networks came back online. The crisis that had caused so much confusion only hours earlier was already fading. Yet inside the service junction, a much older mystery was finally beginning to reveal itself. Varessa understood something for the first time. The governments searching for Caleb were not acting out of fear. They were acting out of memory. Somewhere in the distant past, something extraordinary had happened. Something important enough that entire civilizations still remembered the human who helped guide them through it. And as the final archive files closed themselves behind layers of security restrictions, Varessa realized the truth was far larger than she had imagined. Caleb Mercer was not hiding from the galaxy. The galaxy had been trying to find him again for 20 years. The storm had passed by dawn. Sunlight spilled across the Atlantic coast, turning the glass towers of the diplomatic district into columns of gold. From the upper levels of the convention complex, the city looked peaceful again. Air traffic moved through clear skies. Cargo vessels crossed the harbor. Delegates returned to their schedules as if the previous day's confusion had never happened. Yet for Varessa and Weil, everything had changed. She stood alone in a quiet observation lounge overlooking the ocean, replaying the discoveries of the past week. The mysterious reactions, the sealed records, the government's searching for one man, and finally the truth that had emerged from the hidden archive. Caleb Mercer was not being pursued because people feared him. He was being sought because entire civilizations remembered what he had once done for them. The doors behind her opened softly. Caleb entered carrying a cup of coffee. His expression looked lighter than it had in days. Varessa studied him for a moment. The messages are still arriving. Caleb nodded. I know. Dozens this morning alone. He walked toward the window. That sounds about right. Varessa shook her head in disbelief. You speak about this as if it is normal. Caleb smiled faintly. After a while, most things become normal. Outside, sunlight reflected across the water in long ribbons of silver. For a few minutes neither spoke. Then a notification appeared on the room's central display. Incoming priority communication. The sender identification caused Varessa's eyes to widen. It was one of the most influential interstellar councils in known space. The message was brief. They formally requested Caleb's presence at a summit scheduled 3 months later. Another request followed. Then another. Scientific organizations, diplomatic alliances, historical institutions. One after another. The invitations continued arriving. Varessa finally understood. Entire governments were not trying to locate Caleb because they needed a soldier. They wanted a witness, a guide, someone who had helped them navigate one of the most difficult periods in recent history. You could go back, she said quietly. Caleb looked toward the ocean. I could. Most people would. He considered that for several seconds. Most people are smarter than I am. Varessa laughed despite herself. I do not believe that. Another invitation appeared on the display. Then another. Caleb ignored all of them. What will you do? She asked. He took a sip of coffee before answering. My job. Your job. You have 3 more days of negotiations. Varessa stared at him. That is your answer? Seems like enough work for the moment. She shook her head again, smiling this time. For the first time since arriving on Earth, she no longer saw a bodyguard standing beside her. She saw a man who had every opportunity to stand at the center of history and had deliberately stepped away from it. Not because he lacked ability, because he valued peace more than recognition. Hours later, the conference resumed. Delegates filled the halls. Agreements were signed. New partnerships were formed. Life moved forward. Caleb stood quietly near the entrance as always, observing the room with calm attention. Most people who passed him never realized who he was. He seemed perfectly content with that. And as Varessa watched him from across the hall, she finally understood why 12 Galaxies had spent years searching for one human. It was not because they could not replace him. It was because people rarely forget the person who helped them find their way home.